Looks like we're coming in okay. If anybody joins this, please comment. Let me know if the sound is good and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I got a book through interlibrary loan, which is probably one of the coolest things. You can get books from all over the country from your local library. I got one that's called Subversion in Racial Unrest. And the title of this live stream, which is Who Painted the Negro Red, is based off of the contents of this book. It's not really it's not a nonfiction book, it's not a fiction book, it's actually the transcription of public hearings that were held in the Louisiana State Legislature from March 6th to March 9th in 1957. So what it's about here, let's see, an outline of a strategic weapon to destroy the governments of Louisiana and the United States. Basically what they've got here is a conversation between these two fellows that you see here with me, Willie Rainach, the Louisiana State Senator, and Joseph Kornfeder. Kornfeder was either a Slovak or a Hungarian, I can't remember which, but he was an immigrant to the United States. He was over here in the United States, I think, in the late 19-teens, but did a lot of activity in the 20s and 30s. He was a communist. I think he was probably one of the founding members of the American Communist Party, or he was, he was at least one of the early people, and he was pretty highly placed. So what they're doing here in 1957 is they're talking about plans that happened in the teens, 20s, and 30s about American communism, and specifically the plans that the American Communist Party had to turn black people into communists. And before I start reading, I guess I would just like everybody who hears this now or later to think about the role of black people in American politics, and the fact that most of the black organizations like the NAACP, from the NAACP all the way up to BLM, have basically been controlled organizations. They've not been run by blacks for blacks, they've been run with financial backing of whites or other northeastern groups that I'm sure you can guess what I'm talking about. And it's just not it's not indigenous activity. It's not indigenous to the black community. The only two guys that I would consider to be like indigenous black leaders would be probably Booker T. Washington, even though he was funded heavily by whites. I think most of what they were doing was indigenous. And then also Marcus Garvey, who we're going to talk about a little bit here. Okay, I'm sorry. Give me just a minute to find my place. They spend about 20 pages giving the background of Joseph Kornfeder and the American Communist Party generally, but then we're going to have to get to the point where we're actually talking. Okay, so this is going to be page 34. Rainach asks, Mr. Kornfeder, now to pass to the question of racial incitation, which is, of course, the particular concern of this committee. I have noticed in examining communist literature, particularly literature addressed to the Negroes in the South, the communists advocate a separate Negro republic to be formed in and out of the southern states of the United States. Will you explain to us what personal knowledge you have of the origin of that doctrine and something about the purposes and intents of it? Kornfeder replies, well, the doctrine originated with Joseph Stalin himself. While I was in Moscow, that's how I happened to know about it, and it was tried out on me since I represented the Foster faction to see what reactions there would be to it. I, of course, considered it entirely impractical. When I was then told that this proposition come from Stalin himself, I was very much astounded, because with all the deviltries that Stalin was capable of, his proposals usually had practicability to them. Now this thing seemed to me entirely impractical, and it stumped me so much that I just let go at it. He said it's not too important whether the thing can be done in the United States in the South or not. What is important is to have a unifying slogan around which one could ideologically rally all the Negroes. He said that until then the communists had made various passes at the American Negro advocating one or another issue or remedy or proposition, but there was no unifying slogan. So this proposition of Negro nationalism, nationalism based on a race, was conceived by Stalin as a slogan to get all the Negroes, not just working man Negroes or farmers that are Negroes and so on, to get all the Negroes as a race on the communist side. Well, of course, from that point of view, I could understand that. That is already to do with broad political warfare strategy. But even then, I said, why try to apply it in such an absurd fashion, like trying to tear out a part of the economic and social fabric of the United States? In one part of the United States, I said, I don't think the American Negro will go for that, and it is not practical, not feasible. Well, the answer to that was this, that the American Negro, amongst all the Negroes in the world, is the most advanced one. That if he doesn't go for the idea of racial nationalism, well, then the whole thing is a miscalculation, and of course, Stalin was thoroughly convinced that racial nationalism could be sold to the Negro, irrespective of whether or not it could be applied in the form of a Negro republic in the South or not. That's where this thing originated. First, the American Negro communists that were in Moscow reacted similarly to myself. They thought it was impractical also. But the doctrine was imposed on the party just the same because, well, Stalin was the boss of all the Communist Party. That's how eventually the Communist Party of the United States accepted it. Pardon me. What year was that the doctrine was first proposed? Well, the first time I heard about it was in 1928. That was when Lasovsky first called you up and presented the doctrine to you as a proposal. Is that right? I'm sorry, that was Rainach asking for clarification. Kornfeder replies, that's right. Rainach asks, under the communist proposal, to whom did the Negro's primary loyalty belong? To the United States, under this arrangement, to the United States, or to the Negro Republic, as was proposed? Kornfeder replies, oh, the primary loyalty on the basis of that doctrine would be to the Negro Republic. That's basically the same doctrine as Hitler had, that all Aryan Germans, no matter where they lived, no matter what country they were citizens of, owed their primary loyalty to Hitler's Germany. It's similar to the doctrine of part of the Jews known as Zionists, who had that doctrine even before Hitler, who said that if the Jews will succeed to set up a homeland according to the Zionist program, their loyalty will primarily be to Palestine. Kornfeder's dropping some truth bombs here, by the way. Rainach asks, was this Black Republic to be part of the United States, or was it to be an extension of, say, Africa as the homeland of the Negro? Kornfeder replies, well, it would certainly not be part of the United States. What they advocated is a completely separate Negro Republic, which is created on the basis that the Negroes in all that area have a majority and therefore are entitled to supremacy there, to complete domination. Here again, it's like in the case where I said that the communists speak in the name of the factory workers, the proletariat. Well, here's the same idea. The communists would come into power in a part of the United States in the name of the Negroes, but it would actually be a communist government operated within those several hundred counties, which would go into the formation of a Negro Republic. Rainach asks, well, now on the basis of this proposal of a separate Negro Republic in the United States, it would seem to me that this would result in a more or less complete national segregation. Yet the Communist Party and all the literature they put out pretend to be the foremost opponent of any type of segregation. How do you reconcile such opposition doctrines in the party? Or are they reconciled? Kornfeder replies, well, the communists don't have to reconcile anything. They can advocate totally contradictory policies as long as it yields political profit for them. So this is why this book is important. This is written this was said, I guess, in 1957, right? But it's talking about events that occurred in the 20s and 30s. All this stuff this is what is recapitulating over and over again today. This is how political groups work, and this is how they work in secret. And the Communist Party of the United States, which was a Comintern Stalinist organization, was operating in secret. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Okay. The communists don't have to reconcile anything. They can advocate totally contradictory policies as long as it yields political profit for them. I mean, they're not plagued like we are by conscience or consistency and things like that. They are in political warfare completely amoral. There's no such thing that you have got to follow this or that pattern. So they would advocate a Negro republic where all the Negroes that lived there would be, as it were, segregated, as you say. And at the same time, they advocated that in the big cities of the North, where there's lots of Negroes, that the Negroes should have a separate municipality with their own police and their own mayors and so on and so forth. But of course, the expenses were to be borne by the city as a whole, not just by the Negro section of that city. And that, in their mind, is thoroughly consistent. Why? Because what they actually aim at is to use the Negro, to organize him in such a fashion as to use him as a festering center for rebellion inside the larger community as a whole. Let's read that again. Because what they actually aim at is to use the Negro, organize him in such a fashion as to use him as a festering center for rebellion inside the larger community as a whole. The Negro Republic would, of course, be a communist one. These types of municipalities would, of course, be dominated by the communists in most cases, and each of them would be a festering center inside the democratic setup, which would, of course, under communist leadership, carry on continued disturbances, provocations, discontent, and so on and so forth. With their theory, that's completely consistent. Of course, after they would seize power in the United States as such, they could just abolish the whole business, and who was going to say no? I mean, doesn't this kind of sound like these huge urban centers that are controlled by Democrats and liberals and big statist types, who these big urban centers really often are just like festering places out of which come disturbances, provocations, and discontent? I mean, it kind of sounds to me like the communist strategy worked, or it was taken over by somebody else and employed in a different form, right? They aim to use the Negro, preach a doctrine of racial nationalism in order to use the Negro for their purpose. Once they have used him well, then they will do with the Negro just what they have done in Russia with the peasants and the working man. Just make him a tool for their purposes. Therefore, it's consistent with the theory of using all methods to seize power. Otherwise, of course, it's not consistent. Rainach asks, I believe you stated after you helped form the Communist Party in the United States in 1919, you eventually came to be a member of its Central Committee. Is that not correct, sir? Kornfeder replies, yes. Rainach asks, I believe you further stated that you were the first person put in charge of communist activity amongst the Negroes in the United States. Is that correct? Kornfeder replies, yes, sir. Rainach asks, would you mind relating to the committee your particular experience with regard to that first assignment that you had in regard to Negro activity in the Communist Party? Kornfeder replies, well, the Communist Party activities amongst the Negro here in the United States started about 1921, and they were prompted by a letter sent to the American Party by Nikolai Lenin, who was then the dominant figure in Russia and the founder of the Soviet state. He said in that letter, I am of course not quoting it textually, I am just giving you the sense of it, that they were surprised that in the reports the American Party was sending over to Moscow that there was no mention of activities amongst Negroes, and he considered the Negroes in the United States a strategically important element, and he wanted to see a report of what the Communist Party was doing amongst the Negroes. Well, so of course the party couldn't ignore a letter from Nikolai Lenin, and I was then the junior member of the Central Committee. So they had to put on record that somebody was assigned to perform that function. So I was the one who was assigned to do that. Sidebar here. So what is this? This is 1921 we're talking about. In 1921, the Communist Party of the United States is functioning as an organ, apparently, of the Soviet state. They don't really have an independent existence, right? If you imagine, you know, people often, they want to do this stupid horseshoe theory crap where they say that fascist and communist are basically the same thing. I've never heard of fascist parties in one country taking orders from a fascist party mothership in another country. National organizations should be independent because nations are independent, and that's why communism is cancer for the human race, is because this stuff has been, from its inception as a real functioning organism, the Soviet state, it has always been internationalist, and therefore it will never ever be able to deliver benefits to the human race of any kind. Always just whichever group of disgusting oligarchs happens to be at the top, right? Okay, sorry for that, but anyhow, this is, you know, this is firsthand information from the people who were actually involved at the ground level of all this stuff, and it's always been internationalist. The Comintern has always run all this stuff from the top down. And as we know, in things like the Spanish Civil War, they always killed anyone who disagreed with them. Okay. The party couldn't ignore the letter from Lenin. Okay. Well then, so I was the one who was assigned to do that, Kornfeder says. Well, when I looked around, I found that there was simply no Negro membership in the Communist Party. Even in New York or Chicago, there wasn't a single Negro communist in the Communist Party that I knew. Nobody had thought of doing that before this letter came from Russia. So that's why I titled this, you know, Who Painted the Negro Red? It was the Soviet state. There were no Negro communists, no black communists in the biggest city in the United States, in the hotbed of redness. You know, New York City and Chicago were probably the two places where you could actually find any of these people, and there weren't any black ones. And then a letter comes from the Soviet Union saying, why don't you have any black communists? Get out there and do it. So then they have to start doing it. So this is not an indigenous political movement to black people. This was proselytizing and stuff like that. And we're going to actually hear how insidious this was done. Well, so just the same, since I was the one assigned, I was going to explore the possibilities. I knew from the Socialist Party that there were some Negroes in Harlem in a branch of the Socialist Party which was mostly Negroes, although there were also whites in the same branch, and I looked up one of them, and he advised me to see an individual by the name of Cyril Briggs. Well, I looked up this individual, and he was the editor of a paper called The Crusader, which was the official organ of a Negro organization called the African Blood Brotherhood. Well, I put in quite an effort on this fellow Briggs to see whether I could work him over ideologically. And as I got acquainted with him, I noticed that he was having his financial troubles getting his paper published. I didn't tell him that I represented the Communist Party, of course. I just posed as a liberal uncle who had his sympathies on the Negro side and was willing to help him. Whenever he ran into some trouble about paying the printer, well, I always obliged with a few $100s. That's a lot of money back then, right? This way I became friends with this Briggs, and I worked him over ideologically, and the cant of the journal changed. So what did they do? The communists came in, they started paying these people in this organization to publish their material when they couldn't publish it themselves to their own satisfaction, and then they exercised influence over the ideological scope of the paper. It's crazy. And, you know, so if anybody ever questions, like, you know, if you're getting this money from this source, is that going to have any effect on you? This guy's telling you it definitely did. He was able to change the content of these articles that were being written. And of course, in due time, I got at some of his friends who were on the board of directors, and well, it only took about a year before the controlling influence in that organization upon the top was exerted through me, and they pretty nearly would do, although they weren't in the party yet, with whatever I wanted them to do. Well, and later on, I signed him up into the Communist Party as a member. So that was the first Negro organization that the party got hold of, ideologically at least. Later on, organizationally. That's how the thing started. Rainach asks, what about the NAACP? What was it doing at that time? Kornfeder replies, the NAACP at that time was a rather small organization. To the best of my recollection, it had just a couple of thousand members composed of the upper-class Negroes and a lot of liberal whites. And the aims it had were rather moderate. That would be race reconciliation, and of course it was willing and did defend Negroes in such legal cases as resulted from some riots or some attacks on Negroes, lynchings, and so on and so forth. It was not at that time an organization that you could say was trying to set fire to anything. Just a liberal outfit that tried to do a certain amount of good in bringing the two races together. We decided to ignore it at the time as not being important enough to bother with. Now, my opinion is that Joseph Kornfeder is running interference here. And I don't know why, but it's probably because the NAACP, from about the 5th year of its inception, was being backed by some of the biggest people in New York City and therefore in the world. And basically I'm talking about people like Jacob Schiff and Rabbi Weiss, I can't remember, but Jacob Schiff, who if you've read anything about the beginnings of the Soviet state, you know that this guy put some financial power behind people like Trotsky, was one of the people who was pushing for the United States to recognize the Soviet Union, and all sorts of other really awful shenanigans. And I think it's kind of ridiculous that Kornfeder would gloss all this over. So I'm thinking that this NAACP stuff is, he's trying to play this down because he doesn't want to talk about it, and we'll probably never know why, but to me it's very suspicious. Rainach lets this go. We move on. He says, what was the Universal Negro Improvement Association? Kornfeder replies, oh, that was the big organization at that time. The Universal Negro Improvement Association was being led by an individual by the name of Marcus Garvey. He was a Jamaican Negro, but a remarkable Negro orator. I mean, his oratory just really went over with the Negroes. It was colorful, emotional. He got together in a number of years the largest Negro organization which had until then existed in the United States. Of course, he claimed a fantastic membership. He claimed about 3 million members, but we put one of our men into his office. He was a writer, an educated fellow, as an aide to him, and we found out what his actual membership was. It was less than 300,000 instead of 3 million. Once again, look at this subversion. The Communist Party in the United States by this point had enough people available to it that they were able to get an intelligent guy, a writer, as a clerk, which I assume was probably a black guy, in order to be accepted into the Marcus Garvey Association. And then they just used that to pump all the information out about the organization itself. The skill that these people had at subversion, and it's really incredible. But it was a very active, enthusiastic organization, and so my idea was that that's the one to go after, either to capture it from inside, or if we can't, well, to see whether we can ruin it. That was the big organization at the time. Rainach asks, did you actually do anything in connection with your purpose of either capturing or ruining this organization? Kornfeder replies, oh yes. We have what communists always offer when they want to move in full status. A Trojan horse. They offer unity. Of course, whenever they offer to unite like the tiger unites with the lamb. by chewing it up and digesting it. It's a great analogy. Well, but this fellow Marcus Garvey, he didn't go for the idea. Now, what special reason he may have had, I don't know. He certainly wasn't educated on the kind of fighting that we launched on him, but he probably was afraid if he would unite with us. Well, he had some skeletons in his closet. He was operating a number of rackets, and he probably was afraid that if uninvited guests came to dinner, well, they may sort of notice those things and it may not be so good for him. So he rejected. He wouldn't unite. Well, after that, there was only one thing we could do, since he had a formidable organization and an enthusiastic following. Well, we had to split his organization. What else does this sound like? If you're a right-winger, if you're involved in far-right politics, have you ever known certain groups to be involved with either I'm going to take you over or I'm going to stir up dissent and try to split everybody apart? This is apparently a very old tactic. These communists in the 1920s were saying that it was already old hat at that point. Of course, when we communists decide to split an organization, it's always in the name of doing good, doing better than the other fellow, and so on. Then we had in mind that if that doesn't pressure him enough, well, eventually we'll go to work on exposing his rackets. That's what happened. We criticized his program. His program was that the Negro should go back to Africa, and that the Negro is as good as the white man, and he should show it by imitating the white man. So he had organized an outfit that he called the Black Star Steamship Line, which was supposed to be some number of ships that a combination of freight and passenger allegedly were cruising between the United States and Africa, and between the United States and some southern countries, and so on. And then he also, in the same line of thought, had created something he called the Negro Factories Corporation. He was selling stocks in both of these corporations. Of course, we had meanwhile, after investigation, found out that his Black Star steamship line that he was selling stock in, and the idea was going over quite enthusiastically amongst the Negroes, was a fraud, and his Negro Factories Corporation was a fraud. So after we couldn't do with the fellow what we originally thought we could, and after we had criticized his program, we of course said that the American Negro will never go back to the bushes in Africa. Whatever complaints he has in the United States, complaints and all, he is much better off than in Africa, and he wouldn't want to go there. And if any of them do go there, they will surely soon come back, and we considered this whole thing an absurdity. Well, the criticism had an effect, and he was holding one of those show conventions he would have every 2 years, to which he invited all Negro organizations in this country and other countries. He invited also the African Blood Brotherhood. That was his big mistake. So we sent a large delegation there, and the delegation, of course, demanded an accounting of his income, funds, and other things. Meanwhile, we had created a bulletin which was dressed up as a news bulletin in such a way as if it was coming from Garvey's organization. And the bulletin was sending news about the doings at that convention. The Negro papers, of which there were several hundred weeklies, thought it was news from the convention. But it was gradual criticism of Marcus Garvey, subtle but positive. So he got excited and decided to expel the delegates of the African Blood Brotherhood. Well, after that, we just sent out a photostat from the Maritime Commission, which said that the Black Star steamship line does not own any ships. We sent it to the Negro papers, and of course that was a terrific blow against Marcus Garvey's organization. Then some of the Negroes had bought his fraudulent stock. They came to the offices of the African Blood Brotherhood, and we sent them to a communist lawyer, very able guy, and he helped them to complain to the post office. And so Marcus Garvey was then arrested for using the United States mails to defraud, and the post office raided his headquarters and found there even more than we knew. Well, the windup was that the whole thing ended in a terrific crash. His organization went to pieces inside of about 3 years completely, and the Communist Party picked up many of those pieces. So this way, by these various methods, we demolished an obstruction to communist activities amongst the Negroes, and there was an additional recruitment. Of course, the new recruitment went into the African Blood Brotherhood. That, in short, is the beginning of communist activity amongst the Negroes. The point of that is that when there's a situation, even if you have nothing, you can create something, if you haven't got too much conscience and are willing to use any and all methods. I think we will end this here for now, with the further observation that nobody was behind Marcus Garvey, and therefore Marcus Garvey was destroyed by concerted subversive activity that was being funded by Moscow from the Soviet Kremlin, and that the United States government and the post office in the United States were used as the method by which to actually put Marcus Garvey in jail. And you can go read Marcus Garvey's very interesting quotes about all the people that he thought were actually against him and were behind all this stuff. I recommend that for additional information. But again, as it goes for the communists, this entire foray into black politics is entirely exploitative. They don't really care about black people one way or the other, and the parallels to both what happened in the 1960s and what happened today with like the Black Lives Matter stuff, you've got really similar people exploiting blacks and using them for nefarious and extremely cynical political purposes. And anyhow, I thought it was an interesting book. I think we'll probably do another couple of readings from this, but I really enjoyed reading this, and I hope you learned something from it. Thank you for your time.